Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTANpod. There are several areas of need when thinking about the focus of an intervention program for children with autism. How do we determine the most important features to include in our program? What considerations should we be taking into account? How do we motivate our students? Here to help us understand school-based programs for students with autism is Dr. Vince Carbone. Thank you, Dr. Carbone, for sitting down with us today. We appreciate your time.
Sure, glad to be with you.
So let's start off with, what do you see as the main aspects teachers need to know in order to provide effective educationally based interventions for students with autism?
I think there needs to be greater emphasis upon the science of human behavior and the application of that science through applied behavior analysis. Teachers rarely get a lot of coursework and a lot of instruction in behavior analytic principles, which I think are at the heart of teaching. B.F. Skinner, who did most of the early research in discovering these basic principles that are necessary, wrote a book that unfortunately is not very well read or cited, called The Technology of Teaching. And in that book he outlined for educators what in fact are the methods and the principles that ought to guide effective instruction. Little emphasis is placed currently upon pedagogy as the science of instruction, and instead a lot of ancillary, unnecessary issues seem to prevail, such as, well, we need to extend the amount of time children attend school, we need to have fewer breaks, as opposed to looking at pedagogy as the important issue for teachers to become proficient with. In the book Technology of Teaching, and in his work over about a 25-year period, Skinner focused on what are the methods that bring about the most effective outcomes in students, and those methods are directly related to the behavior of the teachers. What did he highlight? What were the important sort of issues? First, as I said, derived from the basic principles. But the notion of individualizing material is critical. Individualizing it so to the extent that children make very few errors in the work they do, but yet they are challenged nevertheless. So an emphasis upon individualization is critical. The second element that he discovered, and that teachers would benefit from training in this particular area, would be on ensuring that students get frequent feedback, that days and weeks don't go by before a student finds out how they did. So lots of opportunities, and this is the third element, lots of opportunities to respond to the material and not think of education as a teacher just presents materials and children soak it in. Instead, teachers present materials but students respond to it, and then to ensure that there is frequent feedback. So throughout his work on education, he always emphasized the training of the teachers in basic principles, which I think is necessary, and then ensure that there are many opportunities to respond, the material is individualized, and there is frequent feedback on the correctness and incorrectness with error correction procedures. I think if teachers do more of that, those kind of three basic elements, and they receive training in how to do that through coursework in applied behavior analysis within their graduate training, that students would learn at a much higher rate and teachers would be much more effective.
And when we think about this, a theme you kind of kept going back to was that teacher preparation, is educating our folks who are going to be in the field with our students in understanding that our feedback needs to be timely and frequent, and that we need to understand human behavior, and we need to understand how to individualize our instruction to be able to target the needs of the individuals in our classroom. So I think going back to how we prepare our folks to head into the classroom is a key piece there that you highlight.
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. Colleges of education rarely focus on the elements that I've just described. I went through a master's program in special education that was not derived from the principles of behavior analysis, and I knew a lot about teaching. I really never came out of that program knowing how to teach.
Do it. Yeah.
And I think pedagogy, how you go about teaching, is at the heart of improving our educational system. In fact, Skinner wrote a paper where he described that after many years, called The Shame of American Education, where his issue was exactly what I've just described. We failed to apply those principles to American education. It's a shame that we haven't. Teacher preparation is the way to ensure that those principles are part of instruction in classrooms throughout our country.
Absolutely, it's how we teach, not just what we teach, but how we teach. I think that's an excellent point to make. Let's think a minute here for about the critical variables relevant for teaching those social communicative skills. Can you help identify what those variables would be?
Yeah, that's a very important area for the treatment and education of children with autism. One of the primary sort of issues and part of the diagnostic criteria for children with autism includes failure to engage in appropriate sort of social development and social responding. So it's an important area. What we know is that a lot of social behavior is the result of motivational variables, and motivation plays a key role. One of the ways to address that early on is to teach students to do a lot of what Skinner referred to as manding. In other words, under conditions of motivation, asking for things, which you then receive from other people. So one of the first social interactions then for children with autism ought to be develop motivation for items and things, conditions, events, and have children ask others for them, and now the other people now get correlated with the delivery of reinforcement. So one of the key issues is correlating reinforcement with these social interactions and with people in order to develop better social interaction. If you think of typically developing social behavior, you can see the important role that motivation plays in that. The second area that's now developing in our field, beyond just manding and correlating people with reinforcement, is how to condition social attention as a reinforcer. It's at the heart of the development of social skills. If other people's reactions to us don't act as a form of reinforcement, and instead we have to hand over an M&M or a raisin all the time for social interactions, well, that's not the condition under which social attention develops. It develops, we socialize with people because their reactions act as reinforcers for our social behavior. And many children with autism don't easily come under the control of social attention as a reinforcer. So the lines of research that are now occurring are looking at how do you condition social attention as a reinforcer. And once social attention is conditioned as a reinforcer, then all the social behaviors can be easily taught to individuals without these artificial contingencies of having to throw food and other sort of activities at these social behaviors. Instead, they will come under the control of the naturally occurring events that lead to social interactions in typically developing individuals.
So it's kind of pulling back from that notion that it has to be an external item that I get, but it's the social interaction. It's the connection I'm able to make, the back and forth with someone that really motivates me to continue on that path versus I get something.
Yes, that's right. And that I get something kind of notion may be important for developing lots of skills. But if we don't realize that get something is not going to lead to true social behavior, it's going to lead to imitations of social behavior. It'll look like the person is socializing when in fact they're only doing it not for the same reasons that typical individuals do, for the social attention that it derives. They're doing it for external reasons, and therefore you won't get a true repertoire that will generalize across situations and people.
And we're looking for that generalization. I teach the skill, but then I need to generalize it to a wide variety of scenarios where my student will have access and be able to interact with appropriately.
That's right. That's because social attention is in all environments, and if you can bring the individual under the control of social attention, it will occur across many settings and people.
I want to pivot here. You talked about motivation, and I know you've been doing a lot of work around motivation and establishing that cooperative learners. Help me out with how do we alter our motivation for students that we can gain kind of this sense of instructional control in the classroom and assist our students in developing cooperative response and cooperative responding with people, with peers?
That's a particular challenge. It occurs, problem behavior occurs very frequently in persons with developmental disabilities on autism in instructional situations where instructional demands are placed upon the individual. Many children with autism will not acquire a lot of skills without many opportunities to respond to teacher presentation of instructional demands. That also happens to be the situation in which problem behavior and escape and avoidance of that situation occurs at a very high rate. So the issue then becomes, how do we do what's necessary, place lots of demands, get lots of opportunities to respond, but not evoke and cause lots of problem behavior? Well, there's been some research on this particular issue related to motivation, and most of that work is the work of Dr. Jack Michael at Western Michigan University, where he talked about the fact that instructional demands provide a motivation to escape given the history of many individuals with autism and developmental disabilities. And as a result, coming from that analysis are a set of teaching procedures that abolish the value of escape and abate the problem behavior. So in other words, you need to continue to present demands, but how do you have them act as a warning that things are going to get better rather than things are going to get worse, where I have to sit here for long periods of time and don't get much reinforcement? What he basically has uncovered is pointing us in the direction of instructional practices. What are some of those practices? First of all, have students respond actively. Get not just lecture at the student, but get active responding. Secondly, pace of instruction is an important issue. The quicker the pace of instruction, it seems to reduce the amount of escape-motivated behavior. It abolishes the value of escape. Errorless teaching is another component. Teach where students make very few errors. They're challenged, but they make very few errors. And when they do make errors, correction occurs immediately. Also, the idea of interspersing lots of material that is already mastered with only a few targets of unknown sort of material or unmastered sort of material seems to be an important issue. Reduce the amount of effort the student has to do. Bring demands in slowly. In other words, a few demands, then several more demands. Increase the difficulty of demands over time. All of these sort of instructional practices, which are easy to acquire by many, many teachers, seems to override and overcome the difficulties related to high demand situations producing problem behavior that interferes with learning. And that all ties to this notion of conditioned motivating operations, ways in which you can do that and abolish the value of escape.
So by motivating our students, it's really us engaging with active engagement in our classroom, keeping an upbeat pace with our instruction, tying in previously taught skills and previously mastered skills, and then introducing gradually a little bit harder tasks and ones where we're kind of pushing new content out there. And thinking about all the aspects for all students, particularly our students with autism, that are quality, highly effective practices that should be engaging and should be happening in our classrooms would be very helpful and effective. And this goes back to that teacher preparation that we talked about earlier, is if we knew how to be doing these things, they would be occurring from the minute we walked into that classroom, and we wouldn't be then trying to do this reactive versus being preventative.
That's right. One of the principles of behavior relates directly to motivation, and the teaching procedures, once you understand motivation, the teaching procedures kind of fall right out of that. So it goes right back to learning the basic principles and derive from the basic principles the procedures that are related to those principles. I might just add the notion that making sure that the student at the start of the session, where all of these sort of active student responding and pace of instruction are all there, that the student is clearly motivated for some reinforcer that is going to be available to them at some point after many demands. These instructional procedures ensure that you'll get to that point without problem behavior so they can contact reinforcement.
That's a great thing, and ultimately what we're looking for is an increase in our learning outcomes, and our increase in our social outcomes, and by motivating our students and knowing how to generalize that motivation, that's where we're going to get those positive outcomes.
That's right.
Let me ask you this, and here at PaTTAN, and certainly on PaTTANpod, we really look to inspire educators to grow professionally. We want them to evaluate what they know or may not know, and to continue to reach out for new content to help them grow in the field. What kind of advice would you offer to those in the field and to those listening for them to grow themselves professionally?
Yeah, I think to some degree it goes back to what we've talked about earlier. It's unfortunate that many colleges of education don't include curriculum materials and curriculum instruction that relates directly to some of the issues that we've already discussed. And therefore, I would suggest to educators that what they do is they attempt to supplement their educational backgrounds with an understanding of the principles of behavior analysis. There are many programs that are available in which they can enroll to take even online courses in which they can receive instruction in areas that they should have received in their colleges of education but didn't, as a way of learning more about these principles. They can even work towards becoming Board Certified Behavior Analysts. I would highly recommend that teachers who not only have a background in education, but are also Board Certified Behavior Analysts probably produce the best outcomes. So the combination of all of those skills leads to, I think, a very effective teacher. So I would encourage them to receive training. The third area I would suggest to them is they seek out mentors. They seek out other educators who are well educated and knowledgeable in these areas, and try to spend as much time with them discussing their students and discussing it. So there may be some educators on your faculty who have knowledge in this areas. I would try to spend some time learning from them. So I think re-educating to some degree, continuing education in these areas, online courses, learning out the principles, becoming board certified are all things that educators, I think, can do. And that's what has happened here in Patton, and that's why you have such effective practices across hundreds of classrooms throughout the state, is the educators are not only trained in providing education, but have a wealth of knowledge and information related to behavior analysis, which I think makes them particularly effective.
So I think about that behavior analysis, the mentors, and really learning about the human behavior is really going to produce professionals in a classroom setting that get those positive outcomes academically and behaviorally, which we know is integrated.
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, Dr. Carbone. We appreciate it. We're so glad that you're here at Patton to help those of us across the Commonwealth to improve our instruction for our students. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you to all of you in the field. You truly inspire educational growth in your students every day. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTANpod.